Okay. Welcome to the Norfolk Land Trust annual meeting. We had an annual meeting last year on Zoom, and I didn't know how my Zoom worked, and so only 2 people showed up. Nonetheless, we have minutes which we have to approve, and that is the first order of business is to, and I think you all have copies on your seats. Let me just back up a little bit and say that all members of the Norfolk Land Trust can vote. Members, people who are here who are not members of the Land Trust are not allowed to vote. But you can become a member of the Land Trust if you are not, and we hope you will. And you can, if you give even $1. So we hope you all become members of the Land Trust, those of you who are not. So the first order of business is the approval of the very short minutes from last year. Do I have a motion? Darrell, a second? Nobody really should be voting on these minutes because only Shelley and I were there. And all in favor?
Aye.
And now comes the part I love, which is, well, part of it is sad, but part of it is wonderful, and that is re-electing members for our board and electing new members for our board. But first, I want to say that 3 of our board members are going off the board: Michael Scanias, Marie Sifko, and June Peterson. And they have all been loyal, wonderful members, and we will miss them. The members who are already on the board and who are going to re-up for another 3 years are Michelle Childs, Darrell Eaton, Walter Gillespie, Shelley Harms, and Henry Turrell. And then we have 2 wonderful new members that we would like to elect. And one is Barry Roseman. Barry, would you raise your hand? There's Barry. He's been in Norfolk for 15 years?
21.
21 years. But, well, I didn't realize it was so long. And Amanda Viraldi. And how long have you been in Norfolk?
21 months.
And we are so happy to have both of you new on the board. So could I have a motion to re-elect the 5 people I mentioned and the 2 new members? And second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much. And now I take great pleasure in introducing Star Childs, who is going to introduce Geordie Elkins, who will be our speaker about pollinators, and we're all looking forward to that. So please come on.
Thank you.
Okay. I can take my mask off. Okay. I think after the 28th of February, the masks are going away, supposedly, according to our governor. Greetings, everybody. Our speaker today is Geordie Elkins, the Director of Operations at the Highstead Foundation, formerly known as Highstead Arboretum, located down in Reading, Connecticut. From the Highstead website, we can get a rough idea of how capable and incredibly busy Geordie is when one reads his job description. He oversees the day-to-day management and general operations at Highstead, including budgeting, information technology, human resources, buildings and grounds, as well as collaborating with staff on a broad array of projects spanning from land stewardship and research to communications and participating with the Hudson to Housatonic Regional Conservation Partnership. That's a big spread of area. Geordie received his Bachelor's of Science degree from Temple University in Philly back in 1996 and came to work initially as a horticulturalist at Highstead for 5 years, then leaving for a time to work for a commercial native plant nursery known as Planter's Choice down in Newtown, Connecticut. He then returned to Highstead in 2012 to assume his current position as head of operations and has now joined the board of their illustrious directors of that foundation. Highstead has embraced the principles of land preservation outlined in the board chairman's David Foster, very bold initiative called Wildlands and Woodlands. Suffice it to say, today Highstead Foundation is a microcosmic example of how 100 protected acres, smack dab in the middle of urban and wildlife interface around Danbury, has over time connected up with other public and private parcels of land, setting the example for other land trust organizations to follow. The research that Geordie and his predecessors and present-day colleagues do at Highstead can be replicated across ecoregions, quote unquote, from our New York seashores to the rugged mountains of Vermont, and even to Geordie's own native New Hampshire. I'm paraphrasing here an eye-catching quote from the 2021 autumn issue of Northern Woodlands magazine, of which I have some complimentary copies back by the entrance door, that highlighted Geordie and some of his colleagues' collaboration with the Northeast Organic Farmers Association, working in what's called the Pollinator Health Initiative. His skill as a horticulturalist, along with Highstead's headquarters barn, excellent greenhouse, and outplanting areas, provided the perfect nursery and seed source to help reintroduce native flowering plants into degraded abandoned fields elsewhere, all through the southerly regions of Connecticut and New York. And leading through their example, Highstead is also involved in the program Pollinator Pathways that educates homeowners on how to reintroduce native plant species that will help sustain migratory corridors from town to town for threatened populations of lepidopterans, butterflies and moths, and as well as bees. I could go on, obviously, about Geordie and Highstead's excellent work, but I was so glad when he agreed to come and take precious time off his weekend with the family to share some thoughts today on the inestimable value of our mutual work as stewards of protected areas here in Connecticut and elsewhere. I hope that some of you may be inspired even to visit the Highstead Foundation, especially in the peak of mountain laurel season, blossom season, which was Jim and Elizabeth Dudley's initial passion. They were the founders of Highstead. And certainly engage with their excellent information and educational programming links provided on their website. I'll close my introductory remarks with Highstead's simple, what we call a coffee cup vision statement. Highstead unites people and science to preserve nature today for a better tomorrow. Please join me in welcoming Geordie Elkins.
I forgot to mention this earlier, but Mrs. Dudley sends her wishes to you. Oh, I met with her yesterday afternoon, and it said that I was coming up here. She said, "Oh, I've got to send her wishes."
Stand back a little further.
I'm just gonna get this.
Oh, there you
go. Please do the share screen first.
go. Oh, okay. Share screen.
Yeah. Sorry. So in the meantime, when you contacted me to speak, I was pretty excited because I had been at Highstead for a long time, and you've got a connection to Highstead. I think you did a woodland survey there maybe in the 90s. And so I'd sort of heard, rumors and, the name tossed about, and I thought, what a great way to, connect and, with you, who I'd heard about, and with the Norfolk Land Trust. And so today, what I'm going to talk about has a lot to do with connections. And I think if there's anything, that we've learned in the last year, it's that, we need to be connected. Isolation isn't good. And that's for people. We're social creatures. We need to be connected to one another. But I think that's a principle that sort of echoes across all of nature, is that nature needs to be connected. And when it's disconnected, when parts of it become isolated from other parts, that's where we run into issues. So, it's a recurring theme I'll be touching on today. But before we're kind of in the middle of my thing. So before I planned this, I wanted to get a sense of what was happening in Norfolk, what was happening with the Norfolk Land Trust, so that I could, you know, sort of talk in a way that would be compatible, you know, kind of connect with what it is that you're doing, what would be interesting up here and beneficial, and not just me talking. So I got a good sense of what's happening here, and that's when Libby and Star and Michelle told me about the City Meadow and some of the work that's happened and some of the plans for the future. I thought, wow, what a perfect sort of central theme for a talk, because it really is about connecting. It's about, you know, how that meadow is connected to the Housatonic watershed, how it's you know, sort of in the center of town, really kind of dividing the town because of what the DOT did, the way it was just sort of set there as a drainage area, kind of divided the town. But by, you know, bringing it back, it can really be sort of a unifying park-like place that can be beneficial to the town. I thought, you know, what a perfect theme. So we'll talk about pollinators, we'll talk about City Meadow, and also just about connections to the broader New England landscape. But I thought I'd give you just a little background on Highstead, you know, what we do and what we're involved with. Oh, okay, there we go. This is our barn. This is Highstead, dedicated to conserving the New England landscape. You know, we're down here in Fairfield County, in a lot of ways a different landscape from Norfolk, and yet still connected. It's a great place. I love. Why was this working earlier? Oh, you know, I'm clicking the wrong side. Okay. There we go. This is our property, and it's actually almost 180 acres now. We recently purchased some additional land, so that's kind of new news just in December. But what's interesting about it isn't so much the size, which, you know, under 200 acres in Fairfield County, that's a big piece of land. But really what's interesting about it is the diversity of it. And so on one side of it, if you start on the east, we've got this, this big drumlin. It's a grassland meadow. It's home to bobolinks, which are an increasingly threatened bird species, and they migrate from here to South America each year, and they need these grassland meadows to breed in. And as the forests have sort of regrown in the last 100 or so years, bobolinks aren't as common. Going downhill, if you were just to walk around, and I invite you all to come to Highstead. I'm trying to give you a little teaser because it really is a great place to come. And I guess I forgot to say this, but feel free to ask questions and interrupt. I think of it as a pretty casual time. So if you've got a question, ask. But downhill from the meadow, we've got this mesic woodland, rich soils, moist, and it's, you know, dominated by sugar maple and tulip tree and formerly ash. Those are all dying now. Lots of invasives love it too. It used to be an agricultural area that's regrown, and that disturbance has allowed invasives in. We've got this pond habitat with all of the aquatic and sort of edge species moving into a swamp. You know, typically you can't see what's in a swamp. You have to tiptoe around the edges. But this boardwalk gives you opportunity to get right in the center of it and see a lot of things that normally you just wouldn't have access to. Moving up, we've got a second meadow. This is our pollinator wildflower meadow in front of our barn. Very different. It's much smaller. It's not big enough for bobolinks, and it's not dominated so much by grasses, but by wildflowers that have been planted in it over the years. It's really a restoration site. It's not a natural meadow. When our pond's man-made, when they dredged it, that's where they put all the dredging. And the wildflower meadow was sort of the remediation of that. And then continuing up the hill, so Highstead's really two hills. with this pond and swamp in the middle, but two very different hills. One is this clay drumlin that's got, you know, the rich mesic soil. And then the other is this rocky, you know, thin soil, poor fertility, very dry, host to oaks and mountain laurel. So, you know, you can go on a walk that's 1.5 miles and sort of walk through 5 or 6 different habitat types. So it makes it a great spot for educating people about what is in and around their homes, what's in Connecticut, and just teaching them about the landscape of Connecticut. We are a conservation organization, but we don't protect land. You know, we've got our own preserve that we have, but beyond that, we're not purchasing land. Land trusts do that, but we work with land trusts. And as Star mentioned, there's this wildlands and woodlands, farmlands and communities vision for New England. And it's really this that sort of transformed Highstead and why we decided to expand from a native plant arboretum into a conservation organization. This is a vision about trying to protect 70% of the New England landscape as forests, either wild forests or working forests, as well as farmlands and communities. There's, you know, increasingly a recognition that you just protecting land, setting it aside is sort of an esoteric endeavor unless it's connected to communities. You can't protect woodlands. You know, you need places to grow food. You need places to get wood products. People need places to live. And so all of that really has to be worked together. If you just set land aside and say, you know, keep off of it, you know, where do people live? It really has to be a connected sort of integrated vision. And that's what this is. And it was really started by some research that came out of Harvard Forest. I'm not going to show a lot of graphs and charts, but this one I think is really important. And what it shows on this side is this is the amount of forest that's in New England. So you see, and then the bottom line is the time. And so in 1600, New England was about 95% forested. And over time, as settlers came from Europe, we cleared the forests, we turned it into agricultural land, we sent timbers back to England to become masts of ships and things like that. It ended up, some states were down as low as 30% or less forested. But then as there was the push west, people realized it's a lot easier to do agriculture in a prairie than it is in a rocky forest. They, you know, abandoned these agricultural lands. So there's this, you know, this dramatic return of the forest, which was just, you know, sort of unbelievable, almost all the way back to pre-colonial times, until just after World War II, all of a sudden you see all these lines start going down again. And so there's this second deforestation that's happening. But what's different than the first one is the first was really a soft deforestation. You know, an agricultural field, it's easy for seeds to sow in there and grow back into forest. But this second deforestation is really a hard deforestation where it's buildings and roads and parking lots and Home Depots and all that, which is a lot harder to come, you know, revert back to forest. So really this push that we need to do something about this. This is important. You know, we need protected forests. We need working forests. They're good for our community. They produce wood products and maple syrup and lots of things. So how do we do this? We do this through regional conservation partnerships. Connecticut, I think, has about 160 land trusts. If each of those work independently, it's harder to get things done. The idea is to bring groups of land trusts together to think a little bigger, to go after larger grants and do larger protection projects than they would as individuals. And so we host a network of these regional conservation partnerships. They work on things like, this is a bird migration map here. These are, the bright red is where birds need to stop over as they migrate north. If you notice, it's right in the most developed parts of Connecticut, Stamford and southern Fairfield County on the coast. And so what this does is it allows the people, it's helping the groups in that area prioritize. We see that, this is really critical. These are really critical places for bird migration. So it can help prioritize and not just randomly protect whatever land is available. This is another project we work on, the Appalachian Trail Partnership, and it's about, this incredible trail that connects communities from Georgia all the way to Maine. If you were to look at wildlands in New England, you'd see there's a lot of, they track in the same area. So a lot of our wild areas are along this trail. How do we expand that and sort of build on that foundation? This is a project we do, conservation finance and policy. We work to inform lawmakers with our research. We try to find new ways of protecting land. In Sebago Lake, we're working with the Portland Water District to buy land. They don't have to filter their water. To build a filtration plant would be $225 million. Instead, they're investing in land protection. Rather than the old way of government funding it, foundations and philanthropies funding it, trying to get new sources of funding for land protection. And ecological research. We study our land changes in the forest from superstorms and Sandy, changes from invasive pests like the emerald ash borer. This is just a map. Everything we do, we sort of document and try to share publicly so that people who are managing land can learn from some of the lessons we've learned from some of our research. We do deer research. We've got deer exposure experiments. This has been in place for 20 years. And you can see there's a fence here, and the right side of that picture, you can see how dense the vegetation, the undergrowth is in the forest. On the left side, it looks like a savanna with stilt grass in the background. And so you can start to get a sense of how deer impact a landscape. We've done Phragmites invasive plant removal project. You can see here there are stands of Phragmites, and then remove them, and we document that. You can sort of see a white square in there. That's a plot where we look at the vegetation before, we come back 3 years later without seeding anything, and the removal of that Phragmites has allowed the plants in the seed bank to germinate. And that's the same plot. It's hard to believe, but it is. And then land stewardship. And really land stewardship, it's how we take care of the land, but it's also, I think, how we educate people about the land. Not everybody has a large property that they can put a conservation easement on or that they can donate to a land trust. But most of us have homes where we can take action and sort of do things that are helpful to the environment. And so I think of conservation happening sort of on a personal level. It happens on a group level, like a land trust. We do conservation together as an organization. It happens on a greater societal level. Towns and governments, states get involved with it. And land stewardship, I think, is sort of the personal side where we get involved. So this is our headquarters barn, and you can see the landscape here is all well integrated into the surrounding area. It's all native plants that would probably be growing there on their own, just planted in a little more designed and random way, but very different from what we experience in most of Fairfield County, which is, lots of lawns and, whatever's in bloom at Home Depot the day they plant their garden. So trying to get some change from this to something that's more beneficial. I forget why I put that slide in. But
That's good. That's good.
I think it got shuffled. It's in the wrong spot.
That's a good one.
This is, we just remove invasive species. We work with a lake group to help them plant lake buffers around their lake to improve water quality. And then pollinator pathway is a big one. It grew out of the Hudson to Housatonic Regional Conservation Partnership. People wanted to have a way to reach out to landowners, to engage them in changing the way they steward their own properties. And we found that, you know, everybody loves butterflies and pollinators, and it clicked in a way that we never imagined. And it's actually sort of grown into its own thing. It's actually become its own 501c3 now. But that was birthed out of one of these regional conservation partnerships. So it's sort of like an incubator. We try to incubate projects, and the ones that are good, people will take them up and run with them because they see the value in it. If we have to keep it on Highstead life support, I think we need to pull the plug and let it die. So that kind of brings me to City Meadow. You know, what is the overlap between what we do at Highstead and what your interests are here, what the projects are that you're working on? You know, how do we sort of interface together, and what are our shared interests? And this is exactly the type of thing that I get kind of excited about. But, you know, why is it that we're doing this work? You know, I think this is a great, just sort of inspirational project, because here it is, it's an area that's sort of been derelict. It's been degraded by, you know, flooding from roads and all of the things that wash off of them, oils and salts and whatnot. And here it is, this idea of, you know, turning it into something that will have a functional ecosystem, improve the quality of the environment. It'll have native tree and plant shrubs planted around it, pollinator meadows, and more importantly, it'll be really integrated into the city center as a whole. The idea of having educational paths. You know, we've become so disconnected from nature in this day. You think about when people, you know, worked on farms and hunted for their food. Now we go to the grocery store to get food. And a lot of us, we don't even really do that. We just order it online, they deliver it now. So it's a whole different thing. We've really kind of become disconnected. So having this educational opportunity to teach people, to reconnect people, I think is phenomenal. And of course, the reason we're doing it is because there are real environmental issues that we're struggling with. This is the Insect Crisis by Oliver Millman, is being published next week. It's sort of, you can pre-order it on Amazon, but he talks about how 40% of the world's insects are threatened, and there are expected to be, you know, I believe millions extinct in the next, I forget how many years. You know, some places in China have had to resort to hand pollinating fruit trees, and you can only think about how unsustainable that is. And the reality is, you know, for a lot of people, pollinators, you know, it's about pretty butterflies and flowers and gardens, but the reality is they are absolutely essential to civilization. You know, this is a food security issue. If we lose pollinators, there will be food supply issues, and it is a real thing. So they're absolutely important. This, I don't know if I can play this. Yeah. So this I took from my office window, so it's a little blurry, but you get the idea. You can see, you know, dozens of butterflies on there. There are a couple different species. That's a New York ironweed. And I think they're yellow swallowtails, and monarchs are on there. You know, butterflies are sort of like the charismatic poster child for pollinators, and they're wonderful, but there are much more to pollinators than just butterflies and bees. There are all sorts of, you know, ants, beetles, insects. All of those are crucially important, not just for our food crops, but also for pollinating the wild plants, the native plants that are out there. And some of those have very specific interactions where they only have a single host plant for a particular pollinator, or there's only one insect that can effectively pollinate certain species. And so to maintain just ecological diversity, you know, we really need these insects. Oops. You know, I think many of us now are familiar with how the monarchs migrate to Mexico. There are forests in the mountains where they congregate by the millions in these fir trees, and it's kind of hard to imagine. But the reality is, migrating insects are sort of the exception. They're not really the rule. Most insects are staying here for the winter, and they're overwintering here, and they're very local. This is a fritillary butterfly. The larva is on the left, and you may or may not be able to tell, but that's a violet flower. And so what these do is they overwinter as young caterpillars, and they live in the debris, you know, the leaves or the dead grass or whatever. They sort of hunker down for the winter, not as an egg, but actually as a caterpillar. And then violets are one of the first things to come up in the spring and start growing. And so, you know, the young caterpillar is there ready to take advantage and start feeding on this violet. And if you think about, you know, lawns and violets, a lot of people don't think that's compatible. Usually it's, you know, get out the 2,4-D and try to kill it, or mow the lawn. But if you know, if you're trying to get that, you're wiping out, you know, a whole lot of caterpillars and food that is potentially supporting pollinators. So there's this initiative that the Xerces Society is promoting called No Mow May. And, you know, the reason I bring this up, or I like to share things that we can do at our homes, like how can we actually participate in creating habitat or conserving our landscape. And No Mow May is one of these initiatives. It's pretty easy because you don't have to cut your lawn. You know, allow some of it. That's great. You know, hey, the less work I have to do on Saturday, the better. I can really enjoy my weekend. But the idea is there are actually, in most lawns, unless it's like the one that I just showed, that's just pure straight turf grass, there are lots of things growing in there that can actually be beneficial, especially in early spring while pollinators are waiting for you know, trees to put their leaves on, flowers to come out. That can really be both habitat and forage for pollinators. And so the idea is to let the lawn grow for a while. You know, that's radical. Some people aren't going to do it. To go from, you know, a putting green to no mow might be a little extreme, but what I can do is I've got a lawnmower, it'll go up 5 inches. And so you can mow 5 inches. You'll actually go over the top of violets and dandelions and other things. So, you know, I would say if you're fearful of no mow, start with high mow, or do no mow around the edges. Like do part of it. Like how much of your lawn is actual functioning lawn that you need to be using? Like I'm not opposed to lawn. I've got kids, we play soccer and lacrosse, and we like to sit out and whatnot. So, you know, you need lawn in some places, but we've got an abundance of lawn that we don't really need. So there are big sections of it you could, you know, not mow half of it or whatever, but there are places to start. The other thing, this is another video I took. This is from my bedroom window. But at Highstead, we used to mow all of our fields in, you know, October, November, just to make them look neat through the winter. And what you see here in this snowstorm there are a whole bunch of birds sort of hopping around in there, finding shelter. There are some residual seeds that are on some of those grasses and forbs. So there's food and shelter there. But really, I think what's more important is it's overwintering habitat for a lot of insect eggs. This is a katydid, and one of my daughters is Katie. I call her katydid, and I've got lots of pictures I send to her. It makes her crazy. But there are some species of katydids overwinter. They lay their eggs in hollow stems of forbs that are in the meadows. And so if we're going in October and mowing the whole thing to the ground, we're grinding all of that up. And so we've changed the way we mow at Highstead and the way I mow at home, so that we're not always mowing the whole meadow at the same time. You have to mow it in the Northeast. We're not in the prairie. Meadows aren't really natural here, except in very small areas. So it really is, if you're gonna have a pollinator meadow or habitat, it is a management decision and endeavor. It wants to go back to forest. You have to cut the trees out. So it needs to be mowed, but how do you mow it? If you just mow the whole thing the same time every year, you're, sort of, it's equivalent to putting insecticide down almost. So we divide up the way we mow. We'll mow half of it in May or June. We'll do another half at a different time of year, so that we're never mowing the whole thing. If the insects are sort of adult stage and moving around, we'll mow half of it that can move into the other half. But mowing it all in the winter, which is what a lot of people do, you're really starting, below zero for future. And then pollinator pathway is just a project of how we've, tried to engage homeowners and community groups in pollinator gardens. What a pollinator pathway is it's really a decision by a group of people in town that, we want our town to be on the pollinator pathway, and they essentially set up, it's not a formal organization, but an informal collaboration to promote pollinator habitat. And this is where the picture of Norfolk was supposed to be here. Somehow it got shuffled. But even in an area like this, which is, pretty rural, if you look at it from Google Map, you'll still see there are big gaps in the natural habitat where, farms have come in, there's development, and it's broken that connection. Insects, animals, wildlife, they need corridors to move through. And when we block that with something, it's like putting up a dam or a fence, essentially. You think of a fish trying to swim upstream, it gets to a dam, it's not going past it, or a fence. I saw a deer running down the side of a highway trying to get out away from the highway, but the fence was keeping it in instead of out. And we do that to all sorts of wildlife inadvertently. We don't realize it, but the development we do creates barriers. And so the pollinator pathway is about trying to have, connect pollinator habitat through urban developed areas, so that there are connected landscapes. And so this is just sort of a schematic map, but they actually prioritized areas. Where do we think, we want to try in Reading to really promote pollinator habitat? And how does that connect to the towns next to us who also have pollinator pathway programs? It's just exploded, this pollinator pathway. There are hundreds of them. These are landowners who have all signed up and said, we're going to be on it. Do you have a question?
Yeah, are you able to measure the effectiveness of these things? Whether they work? Can you actually?
Which types of things? So the pathways, what we're able to, we've been trying to do that. And so each one of these is somebody's home that they've put on the map. And we've tried to ask them to say, what steps have you actually taken? So the encouragement is to shrink your lawn, stop using insecticides, and plant native plants. And then each person is supposed to say how much, I shrunk my lawn by 50%. I stopped using, neonicotinoid insecticides, that sort of thing. So it's a little hard to get a firm measurement, but we're getting sort of anecdotal responses. And then I think we've probably heard about the birds. This report came out about 2 or 3 years ago about there being 3 million fewer birds in America, which is about a quarter of the population. And a lot of that's because of habitat loss. When we spoke about City Meadow, you mentioned the yellow warbler and the black Burnian warbler. Both of those are species. If you go to the Audubon site and you read about what they eat, it says it's primarily caterpillars and then some insects, and then they list a couple of different types of insect. And then it says, oh, and some seeds too. And so I think in our mind, we've sort of come to think that if we're going to do well for the birds, we're going to plant plants that have berries on them, and we're going to put out bird seed and that sort of thing. But it's really caterpillars that these all need. If you're familiar with the work of Doug Tallenby, he's done a lot of research on this. And the caterpillars are sort of the base of the food chain. They're taking these trees that are, harvesting the energy of the sun in the leaves. The chlorophyll's converting light energy into, carbohydrates. These caterpillars are digesting it, and it moves up the food chain from there. So they really are just absolutely essential. And these are some of the pollinators and the insects that are so crucial to what we're doing. So if you want to really do something good for pollinators and insects, one of the best things you can do is plant an oak tree. Doug's work has found over 900 species of caterpillars that live and feed on oak trees.
Wow.
Those are 4 of the red oaks that we have at Highstead: the pin oak, the scarlet oak, the red oak, and the black oak. And we've got a bunch of white species that are in the white oak subgroup as well. But they really are key. If you compare that to like a ginkgo tree, I think there are like 2 or 3 species of caterpillar that will feed on an exotic ginkgo. The same holds true for a lot of herbaceous plants too. Asters and goldenrod, they're phenomenal. I mean, our landscape should be filled with those. Daylilies, roses, irises, there are hardly any pollinators that really feed on those plants. And then the Ecotype project, which is what Star had mentioned, and this is really in support of the pollinator pathways. When the pollinator pathways started encouraging planting with native plants, it became clear very quickly that there is not a lot of availability for native plants. And what availability there is, a lot of it's coming from the Midwest, which isn't a horrible thing, but it's not necessarily the best thing. And if you think about sort of micro brewery beers, 30 years ago, there was like Anheuser and Miller, and that was about it, Budweiser and Miller. Now you can get, thousands of different types of beer. They're all very local to their area. Well, this is sort of what the Ecotype project is about. It's about getting the plants with genes that are from that local area, not one nursery in the Midwest that's shipping them across the whole country, but really getting sort of the local genotypes that are suited for this area that have been, sort of developed in step with the insects and the rest of the ecology that's here. And so this is, if you're going to plant, what do you want to plant in your pollinator meadow? The best choice is the wild species that was collected locally that has the local genes. That's if you have your druthers, that's what you want. If you can't, a straight species from outside the area, that's a good choice too. And then it sort of goes down from there. Nativars, which are hybridized versions of native plants, exotic plants, and then obviously stay away from invasive species. The northern meadowlark is an example of a pollinator that has a very specific host relationship. And this ragwort plant that it grows on is one of only two species of plant that it can lay its eggs on. That also happens to grow in a very specific habitat of sort of a lime habitat. And as far apart as Reading and Norfolk are, and there's actually, if you look at this blue, that's sort of the vein of limestone that goes down in Western Connecticut and Massachusetts. So we actually are connected, and Reading has those meadowlark sites where they can grow. There are only 2 or 3 in the state. It's an endangered plant. I don't know what your soils are like here. If I know in Canaan, there's definitely, there are lime sites, but it's something to be aware of. If you have a lime site and you're able to plant that, you could be planting, habitat for a endangered species, Connecticut endangered. Yeah, another thing about is, in trying to encourage pollinators is about leaving the leaves. And, we are, obsessed with removing the leaves and then bringing mulch in the spring. And I've never really been able to figure that out. I've always tried to mow my leaves up and then blow them back into the beds. And, it just seems like we're paying to take it away and paying to bring it back later. So they're kind of getting on both sides. But the leaves are really, you think about all the layers and the nooks and the crannies. It's where these things are living and overwintering. And I can't help but share this. We had a lawsuit with our neighbor, which is the Reading Country Club, that have these huge leaf blowers and jet blowers and whatnot, and they're really disturbing sort of the peace at Highstead. And so I started doing research on noise and pollution that came from leaf blowers. And if you look at this, wow, this is a Ford Raptor, and that's a two-stroke leaf blower. And the difference of 0.005 to 1.5 essentially, in 30 minutes of using a two-stroke leaf blower, you create as much pollution as driving a Ford Raptor 3,900 miles. That's driving from Texas to Alaska. Fortunately, two-stroke leaf blowers are sort of phasing out. The newer ones are 4-stroke. They're a little bit better. But not only are we destroying habitat for a lot of these pollinator insects, if we're trying to encourage pollinators and we're getting rid of the leaves and we're cutting the grass short, we're destroying the habitat that they want. It's not just about the flowers and the food. It's about the overwintering places as well. And the pollution on top of it is just like salt in the wound. So that's kind of where we are. I think I get really excited about the different aspects of creating new habitats. And so when I hear about the plans that you've got for wanting to create pollinator habitat here at City Meadow, I think it's great. So I put my email up there. Feel free to follow up with questions, email me, and I would encourage you to come to Highstead and visit. We do have a lot to offer, and I think you'd enjoy it. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can I
Does
ask a
anyone have any
question?
questions?
Yeah.
How did the lawsuit work out?
The lawsuit.
I remember the country club right next door. I found a lot of golf balls when we were doing the forestry plan.
Yes, yeah, it's like they grow in the woods. So it ended up with a settlement where they were moving to hybrid technology.
Okay.
So it's actually worked out pretty well. They now have hybrid mowers that some of the propulsion is by fuel by gas, but then the reels are run by batteries.
Cool.
And they're supposed to be getting
Electric.
electric blowers, but the reality is they're just not powerful enough. So they've agreed to change the times and stuff when they blow, and so there's a reasonable settlement there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
A quick question. Going back to the sort of small property advice, with particularly spring coming up. So okay, not gonna mow, that's fine. Looking for round leaf ragworts and oaks to plant. Are there a couple other things that we should sort of keep in mind to, you know, given the time of year that's coming up?
Yeah, you know, the eco-type project, we're collecting a lot of meadow type plants, and those are ones that people like to plant in their gardens. They are important for meadows. But I think a lot of times with pollinators, people overlook the value of trees. And if you think one tree can have enough pollinator habitat and food, so there's some really good ones. Willows are a great one because they're so early in the year that they're there first thing when, you know, you see, I saw a mosquito in my house the other day. I thought, what in the world? It's warm enough that one came to life.
Yeah.
Well, that happens outside with bees and other pollinators. So you get a warm day and all of a sudden they're out and there's nothing for them to feed on. So some of the, you know, red maples and early pollen producing plants like willows are good ones.
I do see a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah.
Meanwhile, Red has a question.
Regarding pollinator pathways, how are they affected by erosion?
Well, roads, the pathway might be a little bit of a misnomer. It's not, we're trying to make stopover sites might be a better description of them. They're not completely contiguous, but the idea is to try to cluster them in areas to sort of maximize the benefit of what people are doing. So how roads affect them, I mean, they're just a reality that are there. I think it's better to have a pollinator planting, and if the road's there, it's there, than not have a pollinator planting.
Thanks.
So we have a question from Susanna. What does the lawn look like in the spring when you leave the leaves? We have a lot of oaks and those leaves take a long time to break down.
Yes, I don't leave the leaves on my grass. I don't have a lot of grass. So my recommendation would be, you know, think about how much grass you really need. And then the parts that you want to start killing, put the oak leaves there because you'll kill it pretty quick.
What are good sources for local native plants?
Good sources, there aren't a whole lot of them, but I'm totally blanking on the name, but in Woodbury, Earth tones, thank you. Earth tones is a good one. Planter's Choice, where I formerly worked, is a good one too. They're involved with the Ecotype project. They're wholesale only, so your landscaper needs to go there. But if the land trust went there, they could buy sort of as like an organization. So wholesale, I would say that. There's also a new website called Eco 59, which is you can buy local native seeds online from Eco 59.
If I may, I'd like to make a plug for the Northwest Conservation District. They have a plant sale coming up for 3 days, and they work very hard on trying to keep it as native plants as possible.
That's great.
So keep it, that's at the Goshen Fairground. Watch for that, for native plants.
I'm sorry, what's it called?
Excuse me?
What's it called?
The Northwest Conservation District has a plant sale in April, I trust.
Every April, yeah.
At the Goshen Fairgrounds for 3 days.
They'd like you to pre-order. You have a
Yes,
pre-order
pre-order.
for it, probably online now.
Yes, it's online, that's right, sorry, yeah.
One other question from online. Do you use any pesticides, for example, with the Phragmites removal?
Yes, so that is, I mean, you know, pesticides are a touchy issue for a lot of people. My personal philosophy is, I think there is a place for pesticides. I think the problem with pesticides is when we have food crops that are genetically modified to not be killed by herbicides. And then we just wholesale spray them over the top of every single food crop we have. To me, that's a bad use of a pesticide. I think if we have an invasive species and we're able to do it, you know, apply a similar herbicide that will help increase biodiversity in that landscape. I think, you know, it's a trade-off that, you know, everybody has to sort of figure out where their values are and what they value and don't value. That's sort of my take on it. That herbicide, that Phragmites removal project, we did use herbicide, but we decided it was all wiped on by hand. So very time consuming, but also very targeted, and also very uncomfortable because you're in like a full chemical suit with rubber gloves on and, you know, wiping it on. And it's hot and nasty, but the results, I think, you know, paid off. And it was, there's follow-up. You never really eradicate any invasive species. You always have to stay on top of it. But, you know, we probably have, you know, 15 to 20 stems a year that we have to deal with now, where it was, you know, thousands and thousands previously.
Did you grub some of that Phragmites out initially at all, or?
No, we didn't.
That would be an amazing job.
It got in there from the digging from the pond.
Right.
And a lot of the disturbance can actually, you know, reseed Phragmites that's in the seedbed and whatnot. So we did not in that case. We do dig out some things are easier to root out. You know, we'll pull autumn olive and multiflora rose. We've got like what we call weed branch. We pull those out.
Yeah.
But the Phragmites, the runners are so deep and so big. I don't
So
know.
literally contact putting on each individual.
Yeah, it was wiping, it was a rubber glove, you know, connected to a Tyvek suit with like a cotton glove on the outside that sort of is like a wick. And we would wipe it all like a sponge.
Wow, fantastic.
Any other questions? Thank you again for coming up.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
And thank you all for coming. The Norfolk Land Trust Board, stay here because we have a quick meeting after this meeting, which will take about 5 minutes. So thank everybody.
Yeah. And feel free to take copies of the anyone who wants a copy of Northern Woodlands. Those are my copies. Take a copy.
Thank you.